spread out. Maybe you can kind of go more in inside here. But it is my pleasure to welcome you all here. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure today to introduce you to first to our Vice Dean of Humanities, who will say some words, and then later on to our speaker for today. The Center for Advanced Genocide Research has established a fellowship program, and the first fellowship which was endowed is by Dr. Greenberg, and this is the first fellow of this endowed fellowship. So without further ado, I want to welcome Peter Mankell, who is the Vice Dean of Humanities. He is a historian, a specialist of the early modern period. He has a great institute, and if you ever have interest in early modern history, go to him. He is the man. But he is here in his capacity to represent the Dean's office. Please.
Which one? This one?
That one.
It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this event. I think this is right, that other than Margee, I've known Doug longer than anyone in this room. Is that right? Is there someone else out here who knows him longer? So I knew Doug when he was only an early American historian. He graduated from that, leaving me behind as an early American historian. I mean, we've known each other for a very long time, including when he was at Chicago and then got the call to come out here to Los Angeles. And then finally we managed to bring the Shoah Foundation over to campus. Doug then fled, went to New Jersey, but Stephen came, so all is good as far as the Shoah Foundation goes. One of the things that I do in my capacity as, in my vice deaning capacity for the humanities, is try to look for opportunities that we can advance study of the humanities, which is in USC Dornsife encompasses 17 departments and programs, ranging from art history through American studies to Slavic and philosophy. And it also embraces a number of institutes and centers, and really, far and away, the most important in the division, and frankly, far and away the most important in Dornsife, in my opinion, is of course the Shoah Foundation Institute, and first under Doug's leadership and now under Stephen's leadership. It just plays such a leading role. And so for years, I've been talking to these guys about how they sort of do what they're doing about the studying of the Holocaust. And then, as these guys know too well, just a few months ago, I had the opportunity to go on a delegation that went to Poland. I had never been to Poland before. And I went for the opening of this museum of the Polin, Museum of 1,000 Years of Jewish History, which I hope all of you go to, because then we will talk for hours about what we think this museum is all about. But the most important thing I did when I was in Poland was actually to go to Auschwitz. And for me, that was really a personally transforming experience, like on the deepest possible level. And in fact, I got back to LA on a Saturday night. I'm teaching my course this past semester, I should say, it's over now, a course called Telling Native American Stories, a course that ends in 1840. And I was just so changed by what happened to me when I was at Auschwitz that I threw away my lecture notes for the next Monday when I walked in, and I just put up on the board, on the PowerPoint, that we were going to talk about evil that day. And that's what we talked about. I didn't show a lot of pictures of Holocaust. We just sort of talked about it, and I got them to talk about it. And I talked about my experiences at Auschwitz. My knowledge of the Holocaust, would fill a thimble compared to the vast volumes that you guys know. I'm a huge beginner at this. But for me, it was just so important. And I came back here not only sort of fired up with the idea that I'm going to talk to my students, who had signed up for a course on Native Americans, but I'm going to talk to my students about the sort of nature of evil and how do people do things, but also fired up really genuinely with the idea that I need to do whatever I can in my administrative capacity to get more students into the Shoah Foundation archive, to get more students to understand, to come to comprehend the role and place of the Holocaust in the 20th century. The role and place of it is, as we understand larger questions about the history of genocide, which is so wonderful that we have this new center. Not wonderful that genocide exists, wonderful that we have this new center that my colleague Wolf Gruner is doing. But one of the only ways that we can make this happen, to bring people into these kind of face-to-face experiences with understanding the worst aspects, in some ways, of human experience, and in many ways, through their survival, some of the strongest and most important aspects of being human is really through the Shoah Foundation. And so it was such a mark of amazing significance to me in my capacity and my deanness, that when Doug and Margee Greenberg together gave this amazing gift, to have a Greenberg Fellow, and our first fellow is here today, because that kind of generosity from Doug and Margee really makes possible the sustained analysis of the Holocaust, not only as something that every undergraduate should of course know about, but also on an advanced level, because it is so foundational to understanding the modern world. To understand modernity at all is to understand this. And so I am not here in any official capacity to say to you, by the way, you should do what they did and write us a big, nice check. It's a joke to Doug, sorry about that. But this kind of thing, I'm here really on the behalf of Dornsife, to thank Doug and Margee formally and publicly for their generosity to make advanced knowledge of this archive possible. This archive is the most important thing that we have at USC. If you are undergraduates here, you are making a massive mistake if you graduate from this place and you have not spent time with that archive. And I really hope that when the Greenberg Fellows come in, that you'll have a chance as students to meet with them. I hope they get to meet with faculty members. And the great thing about an endowment for this is that we'll have fellow every year doing this. It's just hugely important work. When Doug was president of the Chicago Historical Society, Doug and Margee were living in Evanston, Illinois, and Doug got the call to come out here. Doug is a very conscientious guy, and they had a long conversation, should they actually move to Los Angeles. It was like 3 degrees below zero, and they're having this conversation. One of our mutual friends, Doug, got into a conversation, which was then relayed to me, which was basically, Doug, you have to move, because this is doing God's work, right? This is so important to understand the Holocaust. So Doug has moved on, but through the generosity of Doug and Margee, their legacy remains an active presence for the advanced study of the Holocaust, which is what the Shoah Foundation is all about. I've said more than enough. I'm going to turn it over to Wolf. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Peter, for these words. And I think it was really well said, because just today in my lecture class, we have some students from my class about the Holocaust here. I mentioned that we have the problem in Holocaust research. Everybody thinks it is so well studied, everything is known, but we know actually nothing. We know a lot about Germany, we know a lot about Poland, but beyond that, there is not so much there was not so much done. And Doug himself is studying the field, knows this better than I am. And Jared they meet practically in studying the Ukraine very nicely here. The generosity of Margee and Doug really helps to sponsor, support, and also encourage these kind of studies on areas we had no really big investigation yet on. And we need to learn a lot, especially in these areas like what we will hear today from Jared, where a lot of the actual mass killing went on in an early stage, and which is not well known, because most people think about the killing happened in Auschwitz. The killing happened in these extermination camps. But actually, most of the killing in the early period was made on gunpoint in these massacres in Ukraine, in the occupied Soviet Union. So I want to introduce the inaugural fellow of the Margee and Douglas Greenberg Fellowship here. And it is, for me, also a pleasure, since we met actually earlier. I organize, together with Yad Vashem, a biannual workshop for PhD candidates who work on the Holocaust. And Jared was a member of the first cohort of this workshop. So we met 4 years ago. 2011. But he already stood out as one of the best and the most elaborate PhD students in this field of Holocaust studies. And why did he stand out so much? Because he is one of these people who immerses himself into deep research on the ground. So this is what really sets them apart from them a lot, and which is pretty familiar to me because I'm pretty similar to this. So just in Germany and Austria, but very similar to this. So this is very familiar. So he just finished his PhD, so we can congratulate him. This was just done. He received his PhD under Margee at UCLA. He studied formerly at Northeastern University for his undergraduate studies. And along the way, he already got acknowledgments, not just from me, but from a lot of our colleagues. He earned several very prestigious fellowships, like the Guggenheim Foundation Writing Fellowship on Violence, or the Claims Conference Kagan Dissertation Writing Fellowship, which are very selective and competitive fellowships, which also speaks to the quality of his work. And even more so, he has already one publication on the way, which is on with the title Remembering and Forgetting the Malin Massacre, Memory, Ethnicity, and the Second World War in Eastern Europe, which is accepted for publication by a series of so-called Karl Beck papers in Russian and Eastern European studies, which enable people to publish small books, so to speak, right? Or large articles, from which end you want to see it. I would say small books. And this is forthcoming soon. So this is also a big accomplishment at this very early stage of his career. He also was already, usually people are asked for their expertise when they are done with their publication. People read these books and then they are asked for their expertise. He was already asked for his expertise for the war crimes investigation at the United States Department of Justice for Ukraine. So he worked for them and helped them already for 2 years. And he was also consulted by Associated Press regarding the World War II in Ukraine. So you see, we have really a very accomplished young scholar here. He is emerging just right in front of us, and enjoy his talk.
Thank you for that introduction, Wolf. I unfortunately cannot talk about my work at the Department of Justice, but let's just say I have been helping them. First and foremost, I want to thank Margee and Doug Greenberg. If you had told me a year ago that there was somebody else in the state of New Jersey as interested in Volhynia as myself, I would have said you were probably crazy. I really appreciate the support, not only to come out here and do the research, but I mean the recognition means a lot too. Sitting here just now, I was thinking about where I was three Januaries ago, and I was in a hotel room in Sarny, which is in the middle of Volhynia, which is actually in the middle of nowhere for Volhynia, and so freezing cold and trying to get Wi-Fi on my computer and wondering if anything I was doing meant anything or was going to ever become anything. So 3 years later, it means a lot to be here, and also means a lot to have the recognition. I want to thank the Associate Dean, Peter Mountcall, on behalf of Dornsife College of Arts and Sciences. I want to thank Stephen Smith and Wolf Gruner as representatives of the USC Shoah Foundation and its Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And I want to thank all the staff here at the center who have been very kind to me over the last week, even though, of course, they didn't have to be kind because the weather's so nice and I was so happy to be here as opposed to New York City right now. So Dan, Kia, Alex, Manu, Greg, they've all just made me feel at home, and I really appreciate that. And also a special thank you to Crispin Brooks, who I already told the staff here was some guy with a strange accent walked up to me in Paris at a conference in 2009 and said, "I have some testimonies for you to watch." And I was only a second or third year grad student at the time, and I had actually never heard of the collection. And so Crispin got me interested in watching the testimonies, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So I'm going to give you we'll just give an outline of what's going to happen today, what we're going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about my dissertation project, which is now a manuscript. You're supposed to call it a manuscript even when you're done, but it was my dissertation project I just finished. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology in the dissertation. And then lastly, we're going to give some examples on how I use testimonies in my book manuscript. We're going to focus on 3 aspects of the Holocaust: pogroms, local policing, and then survival in the forest and interaction with partisans and nationalist groups. Now, this is not meant to be a complete overview of my dissertation or all of its arguments. What we're doing is more of a methodological talk, and sort of looking behind the curtain and see how we do history, and obviously in particular, since I'm here, how we use these video testimonies and how we integrate them into our work. So let's start with introducing you to Volhynia, my beloved Volhynia. I realized, so the region of Volhynia had been originally part of the Imperial Russian Empire. In the interwar period, it was part of Poland. In 1939, it was occupied by the Soviet Union until 1941, and then obviously taken over by the Nazis, and then after the war becomes a part of Soviet Ukraine. So this is a place with many shifting borders and governments, and obviously as I realized that this is true for Ukraine in general, because as you can probably tell, this map is now outdated with Crimea, unfortunately. So this is true for Ukraine in general. This is a borderland region. I focus on two oblasts. Oblast is sort of basically a state. I focus on two oblasts in Volhynia. You'll see them listed here, Rivne and, well, actually they're not listed on this one. No, they're not listed on that one either. Rivne Oblast and then Volyn Oblast. You'll see that the two ones to the left here, these two guys. So when I reference them throughout the talk, you know what I'm talking about. Each oblast is roughly the size of New Jersey. The population of Volhynia by the start of the war is about 1.5 to 2 million people. Over the course of the 33-month occupation, somewhere between 17 and 25% of that population was killed. What makes Volhynia particularly interesting is it, as to quote Jan Gross, was a mosaic of religious, ethnic, and linguistic difference. Okay, so this is a very multi-ethnic border region. You had about 68% Ukrainians, 16% Poles, 10% Jews, and then you had a sort of smattering of Czechs, ethnic Germans that we call Volksdeutsche, and then also some Russians. Just to give you a sense of what happens during the war, Volhynia becomes a part of Volhynian and Podolian Generalbezirk. I still focus on my original oblast, because if I was to include the entire new region under the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, I would have to go to about 15 more archives, which, as much as I love archives, I was not going to do. And then here we get a better sense of the area. Why is Volhynia interesting versus, say, other regions in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine? And what was probably, what was easily, we could say this, probably the most violent occupation in modern history. Volhynia was actually a particularly violent place within this occupation, within Ukraine. In Volhynia alone, we saw a major nationalist uprising in the summer of 1941, and then we saw the birth of a major nationalist army called the UPA, which we're going to talk about today. It was a center of Soviet partisan warfare who fought against this UPA. Some of the main partisan groups were fighting in this region, mostly in the northern part because it was nice and wooded. So that they could easily plan attacks there. And then in response to the partisan warfare by the Soviets, you saw a major campaign by the Germans against the partisans, by which they, their idea of fighting the partisans was burning down villages, which they wiped out about 90 villages in Volhynia alone. There were mass deportations of slave labor, which you saw other places. There was an ethnic cleansing campaign in which 60,000 Poles were murdered by hand in this region in the span of less than a year. And then last, but of course not least, the Holocaust, in which we had about 250,000 Jews, 90 to 98% of which are killed during this occupation. Here's a demonstration in Rivne by the Ukrainian nationalists. So in my dissertation, I'm not particularly, my manuscript, I'm going to do this the entire talk. In my manuscript, I'm not particularly interested in German occupation policy. We've seen some studies of this already, actually to the neighboring regions of Volhynia on either side. Instead, I'm sort of interested in a bottom-up history of what happened during the occupation. My goal is understanding interethnic relations and how groups, whether they be ethnic or political or religious, relate to one another vis-a-vis the occupation. So therefore, my manuscript is probably going to be organized thematically versus chronologically. I'm interested in how the occupation creates opportunities, how it restricts, and how it changes modes of interaction, how it forces people to move in and among groups during the occupation. So I come in with questions, and I'm obviously particularly interested in choices about violence. So I come in and I say, how does an illiterate Ukrainian peasant go from working on his farm to becoming an ethnic cleanser 2 years into the war? Now, related to this same point, there's definitely a lot of tension, and we can get in a lot of arguments as historians about this, about how we discuss groups, whether they be ethnic, political, or otherwise, without sort of reifying them. We can talk about this more later, but I do a lot of disaggregating. So I want to show how people oftentimes change loyalties, change stances, and are in multiple groups during the occupation. So we don't put people in boxes, which happens a lot when we talk about the war. And it's a natural reaction because it's so confusing in a region like this. You want to call someone a policeman, or you want to call someone a nationalist or a partisan, but they oftentimes serve in multiple groups and do multiple things. And so instead of trying to make things more complicated and also more simple at the same time, I do discuss all these overlapping layers of events and of violence. And what I want to do is really unpack them and show how they're connected, and also use people's biographies to show how people work across these different themes. And so if I was doing just the Holocaust in this region, I might be a little bit more isolated, but by looking at these other events, I can see how things are connected. So you can answer questions of how does somebody who participates in pogroms then also become involved in ethnic cleansing. You could also ask how someone who's a Holocaust victim ends up in the Soviet partisans and is then perpetrating violence himself against his neighbors. So able to sort of answer these questions, we need to look at the big picture. I'll give a brief overview on the Holocaust very quickly in this region, just so we can orient ourselves for the remainder of the talk. This work is very much, my work on the Holocaust is very much what one scholar called a turn to the east, which you've already heard the people introduce me today talk about. This is not the Holocaust of the concentration camps, the enormous ghettos in Western and Central Europe. This is what has been known as the Holocaust by bullets, by bloodlines, which probably many people in this room have read or heard of. It's a new book. And as Omar Bartov called Eastern Europe as a site of genocide. This is a place, to quote Omar Bartov, where people were slaughtered in front of their family and friends and colleagues, in the cemeteries where their ancestors were buried, on forested hills where they had dated their lovers or picnics with their children, in the synagogues in which they had prayed, in their own homes, farms, and cellars. So these are people who are murdered. This is a mass murder in their own communities. They're not taken to other places and murdered. And again, to think about it, to put it in perspective, you have 1.5 million people killed in Eastern Europe before the camps are even built. In terms of Ukraine, I have the numbers up here. Yeah, well, in terms of Ukraine, we have about 2.4 or 5 million Jews. Before the war, about a third of those are evacuated. We end up with about 1.4 to 1.5 million in occupied Ukraine during the war. And then, as I said, for Volhynia, we have about a 250,000. I've sort of turned, these are my phases for how I look at the Holocaust in my work or in my manuscript. We have pogroms and first wave shootings. First wave shootings are what typically known as, it's also called the first sweep, is when the Einsatzgruppen comes in. They usually shoot intelligentsia and men in small shootings in towns around Volhynia. We also have pogroms, which we're going to get into in greater detail. Ghettoization is a larger project. People are mostly ghettoized within their communities where they're already living. Sometimes they're moved from other streets in the town. Sometimes people are brought in, but the ghettoization mostly happens where people are already living. And then we have the second wave shootings, and these are the mass shootings. This is the shootings in which entire communities are murdered. Now in the East, the shooting, even though it's organized by the Germans, again is often done by local populations. They are integral to the shooting process, which we'll talk about. And then finally, the last phase is when Jews basically escape to the forests or they're being hidden, is when they have to basically survive until the end of the war. So that should help orient us. Just a few words about my methodology. I'm sort of, and these are the people who have trained me, I'm what they call archivnaya krisa, which is an archive rat, as we say in Russian. I very much love spending time in the archives, and most of my research is archive-based. But what I've done is, and I sort of call it, no, I call it a holistic approach, because I like to bring in a lot of newer methodologies that haven't necessarily been typical for archive rats like myself, which is using video testimony extensively, and not just for discussions about memory or trauma or these things, but for empirical research. And as well as sort of going to the people, as we say, trudging around Volhynia in broken down buses, and going into villages and talking to people and trying to find survivors or witnesses myself, and building a history that way, which sometimes is work we would sort of associate with anthropologists, maybe, or sociologists. I've listed my main sources here. I'm familiar probably to many of you in the room. I'll talk about two, which I think are important for the remainder of the discussion, are also important for the manuscript. The first, CHGK, we call the Extraordinary State Commission. This was set up by the Soviets before the war even ended. As they liberated territories, they created commissions on various government levels, and they came in and they basically interviewed hundreds of thousands of people about what had happened during the war. So this is a very valuable source. We've really only had access to it since the 90s. There's just incredible stories in here. And what's very valuable about these testimonies is people's memories are fresh. These things are being taken in 1944, 1945. I've sort of gone through pretty much all of them for Volhynia, which is probably 50, 100,000 pages. The second source, which has been newer, has been the opening of KGB archives in Ukraine, which has happened under the Yushchenko regime, and it's sort of been, Ukraine's a strange place to do research, sort of kind of been open for a while now, depending on who you are and what day it is and what you're wearing. These trials, I think, happen to be, I think they are probably the most valuable source needed to look at local perpetrators during the Holocaust in the East. There's a larger discussion to be had, and it's actually probably my next manuscript will be on the trials themselves. They happened basically from the end of the war until the fall of the Soviet Union. Some cases are better than others. For instance, in my chapter on local auxiliary police, it's a 30-tome case with something like 1,200 pages of material. They went in and interviewed every single person who was alive in a county during the war, dug up all the mass graves. You can see the bullet casings in the trial proceedings. They're extremely valuable materials, and that's something that I've integrated into my project. That's a new source. Why video testimonies? I'll sort of lay out three reasons right now, and we'll hit on these throughout the talk. They provide important clues that are not present in any other source material. So even though you're an archive, right? Even though you spend every waking moment digging up information in archives, it doesn't mean that everything's there. There are a number of aspects we'll talk about today of things that I found in the video testimony here that does not exist in CHGK, in the war crimes trials, or other places. One example, which actually I'm not going to talk about in detail, is the town of Cortilis, really in the middle of nowhere. We had no information about what happened in the first few weeks, month of the war. The only place there's information on this anywhere is here at USC in the archives. Second, triangulation of sources. Any good historian should do this. For all you undergrads here, you should always be able to prove, you always want to prove everything you can with as many sources as possible. Why is this important with what I'm doing? One, there are good reasons not to trust Soviet sources at times. We can talk about this more later. But as any good historian should do, you should know how to read the sources you're working with. So it's always good to check your Soviet sources. But also, number two, it's a very highly politicized situation right now in talking about the Holocaust in the East, and especially in Ukraine. So you may triangulate your sources and you can prove it, you can prove it in every which way, but many people are incredulous. And so it's very important to be able to show from as many angles as possible what you're saying is true. And then third, I believe there's an ethical issue. I think providing the voices of victims is important. This is coming from somebody who's largely produced a perpetrator-focused study, local perpetrators. But even if I'm focused in on local perpetrators, I believe that the voices of the victims need to be present. So let's get on to our first issue here, talking about pogroms in Ukraine. So the discussion of pogroms, I'm going to actually I do this a little quicker than I want. The discussion about pogroms has evolved a lot over the last basically 5 years. We originally came into the idea about pogroms in Eastern Europe to quote Roel Hilberg, who's a much revered historian, who said that truly spontaneous pogroms, free from Einsatzgruppen influence, did not take place. So the idea was that the Germans came in and they sort of organized the pogroms themselves, and then that there were no pogroms from below, or that other people were not organizing pogroms. My research has shown that this is actually not the case. My research has shown that yes, the Germans did come in and organize pogroms, but we can actually prove through testimony, through a number of other sources, that nationalists organized pogroms in the region of Volhynia, that there were actually multi-ethnic perpetrators of pogroms, so you'll have Poles and Ukrainians working together, and so on and so forth. So this really changes the way we talk about pogroms in the region. I found pogroms that we didn't even know about before. So we're actually finding out that this is a much larger phenomenon of violence during the war than we previously thought. Here's a photo from an unknown pogrom in the Oblast. So let's actually get to some videos. Here you get a sense of how many places pogroms have actually taken place. So I want to talk about 2 pogroms, and we'll watch a couple clips. The first is Tuchin. Tuchin is a very well-known, it's actually a very well-known pogrom. We've sort of known that a pogrom has taken place there. We know that it was very violent. We know that there was local participation. This was up until recently. From my own research, I know that the Ukrainian nationalists took over the government in the week after the war started, where there was basically no one in power, and that they organized a pogrom in which they went around from homes and basically beat people with bats and axes and killing 60 to 70 people. And then the second pogrom we're going to look at is Rokitne, which was actually a Polish and Jewish town in a different part of Rivne Oblast. There was a local Volksdeutsch who sort of made himself king in the first days of the war, organized a band of people who worked at a local factory, Poles and Ukrainians, and they went around and beat up the Jewish population and stole their things. So let's first start with Tuchin.
They didn't know in the middle of the night of killing people without bullets, so they did not till the morning. And in the morning, after our town was dead, this was already too much to take to the nerves. People were already in such a shape that it was terrible even to talk to one another.
And nobody knew this was coming?
No, because the Ukrainians got drunk and they decided to massacre the Jews. And that's what they started to do in the evening, and they finished in the morning. And no one didn't know about the other.
And we'll go to the next clip here. This is Laura.
Our home was it was a new building, it was such a beautiful home that it attracted attention. Even though our name was not on the list for the pogrom, the German soldier, we were looking out through the window, and we saw that he said, well, what about here? And so they said, the Ukraine, okay, let's go. There was a whole bunch of them with a few soldiers, German soldiers. So there was a big pogrom a week after they entered our town. And my mother and I were beaten up terribly. They threw my mother out into the courtyard, and they beat her with guns. I remember my sister and I were standing on the doorway, and we were screaming, and her blood was gushing out of her head, and I remember that sound. It went like shh, that kind of a sound. And after a while, she stopped screaming, and they said, well, she's done. So my sister pulled me away from the doorway, and the next thing I know, I was lying under a bed in a bedroom, and apparently they were looking for me, and I must have been.
No, stop it there. Laura obviously survived. She was in a coma for 6 days. She actually still does not have full use of her right hand. So I actually tracked Laura down and actually got to interview her myself. And it was sort of a unique situation, and it often is when I find survivors to talk to them, because I wanted details about this pogrom, and I said and Laura and I talked about it, and I said to Laura, do you know the names of these people? Ivan Stadnik, Vasily Gomanyuk, Ostapenko, and so on and so forth. And she said, no, who were these people? And I said, these were the people who came into your home and attacked you. And I knew this because I had pulled together sources from Moscow, and I'd also read a post-war trial where I was able to find the names of the local nationalists. So these people were not just random people. They were actually part of a nationalist group of this Ukrainian organization of Ukrainian nationalists who perpetrated the pogrom. Now, of course, it's not always black and white. She says, and we talked about this in detail, she said there was one German with them, and the German pointed out the house. But the people doing the killing, the people who beat her and her mother, were actually the Ukrainians. And also pulling together other sources, you may say, well, maybe she's mistaken, but you can look at a testimony from 1944 from one Tuchin survivor who gave this information to CHGK. This Russian commission said, quote, there were no Germans present during the pogrom. And you can also look at the Yiskor testimony from her father, who gave testimony 50 years prior, giving very, very similar account of what happened from a different angle. So this is one way in which we're able to sort of bring together sources to get a better view of what happened, of a confusing and violent event. So we'll just turn to Rakitna now.
At certain time, nobody came into the town. At this time, the Poles organized a pogrom.
Was there a reason for the pogrom? Was there any excuse?
But there is no reasons, as far as I know. There is no reasons because the war started, nobody was there. The Germans wasn't there. The Polish army, the Russian army ran away. There is nobody in the town. This is what I recall it. And later on, the German came.
Another survivor from Rakitna actually says we were waiting for the Germans to show up because we were so terrified of the local Poles and Ukrainians. So again, here another example, another place where there's pogrom, another place where there's a pogrom from below, but here's a different situation. Through my extensive work on the perpetrators, we know that this wasn't a nationalist formation. And again, we actually know that this is a multi-ethnic pogrom, something that hasn't been discussed a lot for the region. And also, again, these are just serve as examples. There are a number of other highly detailed accounts of these types of pogroms in Volhynia from other towns that I've integrated into my research. So we'll shift gears now and go to our second point. Talk about local auxiliary police. As I've already mentioned, I do an extensive study of the local auxiliary police during the war. These are essentially local policemen in the countryside and the cities. The Germans do not have enough people to completely police all of occupied Europe at this time. So oftentimes in the countryside, most of which what Volhynia is, you will see maybe one German or two German leaders, and you will see police forces which are run by Ukrainians. There's a police chief, usually a couple assistant police chiefs, and then a Ukrainian police force. I've cataloged in my work about 1,000 policemen for this region, so which I have biographical information on them. So I'm able to sort of look at larger questions about what they're doing before the war, during the war, and after the war, and also do some demographic studies of who they were. Some of the main discussion about policemen, and this is sort of asking questions about perpetrators that we've asked about the Germans. We say, were these regular people, or were they all sort of the worst the town had to offer? Were these the outcasts? Were these the people who were the sadists? So this is one of the big questions that I ask in my chapter on the police. And also the other question is, how well did they know their victims? Are these people that they actually know? The Germans coming in or participating in the shootings, they don't know their victims, right? They can't even find out who the Jews are half the time. It's usually the policemen are helping them do this. So sort of picking apart these communities and trying to figure out what these relationships are and who were these policemen. And then this is another place where testimonies again can play a key role. And the policemen, which is what you'll see in these testimonies. You watch testimony after testimony from Western Ukraine, you will see that local police are the people guarding the ghettos, rarely not the Germans. Local police are the ones who are interrogating people. The local police are the ones participating in the shootings. We'll show one example. This is from Ostrozhets.
It was probably about, at that time, it was probably about half a dozen Germans, and the rest of them were Ukraine police, which worked for the Germans.
They were cooperating, helping?
In our area where I was born, the Ukrainians probably did 90% of the killing.
How do you know that?
Because when they liquidated our ghetto, which later on, I believe they had like 3 Germans, the rest of them were all Ukrainians. They just, they had, I believe it was like 2 Ukrainians, 2 policemen when they were Ukrainian. There was very few Germans there. There was a lieutenant and probably about 3 assistants, and everything else was done through the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian commandant, Ukrainian police. I think they have one or two Ukrainians, and then they have probably like 4 or 5 Yiddish police.
So again, you might ask yourself, well, maybe this is an issue of perception, this is one person, but if we pull back and we look at the macro picture, by 1942, in the Ukrainian countryside, the ratio of Ukrainian to German police is about 11 to 1. So when you're watching testimonies from these survivors, and if all they see and they hear are local policemen, this actually makes sense when you pull back and look at the data. Another issue, well, actually I already spoke to, is asking questions about how well they knew their perpetrators. This is going to be in Russian, so I'm going to turn it down and just kind of give you a quick synopsis of what he's saying. This is from the town of Rafalovka, and let's click it first.
Ну как они выглядели, они питались хорошо, вообще как полиция, как она...
Они полицию содержали, нет.
So he's asking, what were the police like?
Они содержали полицию.
The police picked people up. They did it themselves.
Где можно брать, где можно этот как. Вот это разбойники эти все.
He said the police were robbers.
Головорезы такие.
Они знали, кто еврей, кто не еврей, да?
Did the police know who was a Jew or who wasn't?
Это же свой этот как. Вот мне.
Of course, of course.
15 метров.
15 meters from us, there was this family. They were a musical family. They used to play at the Jewish weddings. We paid them for the weddings. Their oldest son, their younger son, they all went and joined the police. He became the head of the police. He forced the Jews on the ground and made them eat grass. He beat them if they wouldn't follow his orders. What was his name? Palamarchuk. Ivan. What happened to him? He was tried. And so we know he was tried, and I had already had all this data on this police force. I had information on, I guess, 60 or so members of the Rafalovka police force. And then I watched this testimony, and when he said Palamarchuk, I put it together, because here's Palamarchuk's post-war war crimes trial. Here's the Palamarchuk brothers who show up in Chugaka in the Soviet Commission. And here's actually a 1993 article written for a Ukrainian newspaper in which the Palamarchuk family was sort of portrayed as victims because the Soviet partisans attacked them for being policemen, which is actually quite interesting. And then another anecdote: after the war, when they arrest Ivan, they actually bring Grigory into the room and they say, "Do you know him?" And he says, "Of course I know him. This is the head of the police." And Grigory acts as if the policeman acts as if he does not know them. So again, here's a family who played at Jewish weddings. So these are not, and you can watch his body language and expression during the interview of like, of course these people knew who we were. Of course I knew who they were. Okay, these people were not strangers. And this is what the intimacy of the genocide looks like in a place like Volhynia. I'm actually going to skip ahead now. So let's go to the last phase. So after the liquidation of the ghettos, in which hundreds of thousands are murdered and shot into mass graves outside their towns, we know that about this is an estimate, 10 to 35,000 Jews escaped to the forest. And so given the numbers that we know that somewhere between 90 and 98% survived, this means about somewhere between 6,500 and 31 31,000 Jews were murdered during this last phase of the war. So the question becomes, who was doing the murdering? This is a photo outside of Kremlin. This just came out in a Ukrainian publication, which is just unbelievable. Those are all Ukrainian policemen. In short, the people who were murdering the Jews, hiding in the woods, were again the local policemen who continued to hunt them down and continued to do their job long after they had already liquidated most of the Jewish community of Volhynia. And then the other people who were participating in the violence were the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was basically a terrorist political organization in interwar Poland, cooperated with the Germans in the late 1930s, and then were trained by, a lot of the leaders were trained by the Gestapo in Poland from 1939 to 1941. Many were given key positions in the police during the early phase of the war. Some left the police and went to the forest then. But by 1943, when sort of the tide had turned in the war after Stalingrad, many of the policemen left to the forests and joined a newly formed army that was coordinated by Roman Shukevich and Mykola Lebed, and which operated out of Volhynia. The idea was to pacify the area in expectation of the Soviets arriving. And so they also fought against the Germans. They fought against Soviet partisans, but they also fought against ethnic enemies. It's the UPA that carried out an ethnic cleansing of 50 to 60,000 Polish Volhynians, and they also attacked other ethnicities in the area, and they also attacked other Ukrainians who wouldn't follow their line. To quote to quote instructions that one UPA soldier was given in 1943: kill all enemies of the UPA. That is Poles, Czechs, Jews, Komsomol members, Red Army officers, policemen, and all Ukrainians who even slightly sympathize with the Soviet authorities. The discussion, and we're talking about politics and talking about how to put together this history. Before we've come to these testimonies, the only place you could read this is in Yisker books and a few other places, but there was never much discussion of what happened to these Jews in the forest. And here's where testimonies really come into play, because, again, as anyone who's watched these testimonies for Western Ukraine, literally every single Jew who's in the Volhynian forest, there's one group of people or two groups of people who they're terrified of. Those are the local, the police, and those are the UPA, who they often call Banderovci, after Stepan Bandera, who was one of the main leaders of the movement, even though he wasn't in Volhynia. You see this time and time again, and I'll show you a clip from one testimony in a second. It's completely unambiguous. Yet, when you read most of the literature on the UPA, if you go to your library right now, this part will be almost completely excluded. I will give you a quote from one of the leading historians of the UPA, Professor of Emeritus at Rutgers Newark, Taras Hanchuk. Neither the Ukrainian underground movement nor any other organizations thus cultivated anti-Semitic programs or policies. They readily accepted Jews into their ranks and sheltered them from Nazi persecution, despite the popular perception of Jews as promoters of communism. So not only did they not participate in killing Jews in the forests of Volhynia, it was so nice of them to let Jews into their ranks. This has actually been a popular myth that it was a multi-ethnic fighting force and that they let Jews into their ranks. We know that we've identified perhaps a handful of Jews in a force that's about 10 to 30,000 members strong. And this is somehow used as an argument to sort of justify their actions in the forest. So let's go to, how much time do I have? Actually, we have time for a couple of clips. First, let's listen to, this is an overview of the activities. Let's listen to a clip. This is about policemen who also continued to hunt and kill Jews in the forest.
There was one woman. She was an attractive woman. And every night, a couple of these policemen would come in and they'd take her with them. And
she was another worker?
She was one of the, survivors. I mean, she was another Jewish person. I don't know what she was doing. I guess it was, if she was working, I don't know what she was doing, what kind of work she did. I stayed mostly inside. These people were doing some kind of farm work. But every night that happened, this woman, and I guess, as I understand it, they were having sex with her. And you know, something blanked out, and I don't remember exactly how.
This is Irvin Miller, was hiding in the Ostrazet region. And these are also other Jews who were being hid. Police knew where they were and would go and do this. This is also a topic that you'll find in other testimonies, which again is very difficult to find. You won't see this in Russian testimonies, and you won't see this in post-war trials. But again, this issue of sexual violence, which we may assume was happening, but it has been very difficult to find evidence of it. But Ukrainian policemen, along with Germans, routinely went into ghettos and raped Jewish women. There was a story actually I found this week for the first time. The Germans actually used a local helper who is named Alyosha, who came in and would actually find the women for the Germans. And he, this very powerful testimony, and he actually survived and lived after the war and was still alive actually when the person was giving the testimony. This is in the Stepan region. So we'll go to the next testimony here. This is from the area of Mizuch.
I want to mention one thing. When there was the action, they ran away from our town, many young Jewish peoples and girls into the woods. Our woods, no German soldier had the courage to go into our woods. All the people were killed by the Banderovцы, by the Ukraine. They killed them all. They killed them all. And they told me a lie. You are an intelligent man, you're gonna work for us. And it was a lie. They killed all the Jews whom they caught. So I did believe.
He was trying to be recruited by the UPA. Now, and again, what would happen, those who actually, and we actually see testimonies like this in the archive too, again, showing that it's not always black and white. You will see testimonies of Jews who were in the UPA, but what we know is once they were done, once the war ended, they were usually executed before the Russians showed up. They would use them because they were literate. They would write. They were acted as couriers. They would do leaflets for them. And again, if you're living in the woods and everyone's hunting you down, in a lot of cases, this seemed like the best way to survive. We'll see one more testimony.
They killed the last 200, and we were running. This was January the 4th, 44. And we were running, we didn't know what direction. They didn't want witnesses. So they made sure by the killings the last night that the Russians would be very close. So we ran from the place it calls Kudrinka. And we ran, we came to a place, Stara Huta.
So this was Figi, who we showed earlier from the pogrom in Tuchin, and she was living in what some of these call family camps, where this was actually a unique situation. We had about 200 Jews in this area of Kudrinka. They had actually went to a Polish village that had already been wiped out by the Ukrainians and had been living and working there, and were somehow allowed to be there by the UPA. And then, as she said, she was lucky enough to leave early. Ahead of time, when the Russians were coming back in, the nationalists came in and then wiped out the entire camp of survivors. We will go.
Did they know you were Jewish?
Yes. They knew I was Jewish. Why they?
This is Joseph Grossman, a survivor from Stepan, who actually was in an UPA unit as well. So it was.
Didn't kill me. I don't know. They killed every Jew that they caught. Not the group that I was with in that area, but when I came back to Stepan, and by the way, I was with them for approximately 9 months after the Russian liberated Stepan, because I couldn't escape. And if I had shown that I was interested in escaping, obviously I would have been killed.
So here you have a person, his entire family's been murdered, he's been hiding in the forest, he gets recruited to join this nationalist band. He does work for them because he values his life. He's held prisoner for 9 months after the Soviets have showed up. So everyone else has come out of the forest, and even though things weren't exactly great under the Soviets, but he's forced to stay in the band because he fears for his life for an extra 9 months. And he actually, the testimony gives an account of his miraculous escape. And again, we asked ourselves, what about the reliability of these testimonies? Perhaps perhaps it's just an issue of, perhaps they're confused, it's just an issue of perception. But again, when we bring together other sources, we bring together primary sources that show the point of view of perpetrators as well, we can see the credence of these testimonies. So I found the diary, which you will not be able to see if you go to Rivne now, because they will tell you that it does not, they'll tell you that collection is closed in the archive in Rivne. And it is a diary of an UPA soldier from the Kolodzinski Sakhin. This is a platoon. I'll read you 2 entries from his diary. 4 November 1943. Received a report that Jews had nestled in the forests of Ostrivci. We shot 4 Jews, 2 escaped, and we caught 2 alive. And then the December 15 entry. The infantry caught 10 Hungarian Jews in the village of Sielec, who had escaped from a work battalion. That day we dispatched them to the womb of Abraham. Okay, so these are accounts of a perpetrator, and you have the victim accounts of what life is like in the forest. So again, when we bring these sources together, we get a very strong picture of what life was like in the forest for Volhynian Jews. And then again, with the 3 aspects we talked today, this one more than the others, we don't have these accounts other places. So most of my work and my dissertation when talking about this final phase of the Holocaust is based on the testimonies here. And we estimate somewhere between, at a minimum, of 1,000 to 2,000 Jews who had already survived 2 mass shootings were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists in the forest. And also, incidentally, this is something I've noticed this week during my work here, you'll actually see very interesting testimony on ethnic cleansing of the Poles. It's not keyworded yet in the system, but Jews who are hiding in the forest, they're well aware of what's happening to their Polish neighbors too. So you see very intense testimony about the ethnic cleansing campaign, which has been largely ignored in a lot of the literature. So I will... To conclude, when the Volhynian Jews staggered out of the forest upon liberation in winter 1944, they found few people from their once prosperous community that had survived a 33-month occupation. 250,000 of Volhynians Jews had been murdered. Those who had been fortunate enough to evacuate, like Natan Gendelman from Rakitne, which we've already talked about, came home to a horror that he simply could not believe. In the Rakitne Yizkor book, Gendelman wrote a poem. In it he said, "Ukrainian soil and its breadth and length absorbs the blood of martyrs and saints." The loss for Gendelman and others was immense. He lamented about the place he used to call home. Writing about Volhynia, he said, "O Poland, the land of my youth, you gave us young people full of life. There we studied and played, we swam in your rivers. We enjoyed your gardens and we forged friendships in your forests. We were raised in your midst and we were creative. We established communities. So many writers and poets emerged from among us." What few Jews stayed in Volhynia during the post-war period and the Soviet period left in the early 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. Give you an example, in Rivne, where there were once 20,000 Jews, this is one of the main the capital, you only find a couple hundred. And also I'll mention the synagogue is actually now used as a gym. Though Volhynia is now a homogenized Ukrainian space, you can still find traces of its multi-ethnic past, the outlines of mezuzahs on doorways, streets named after former Jewish residents on occasion, and the collapsing structure of synagogues in town centers, which puncture the cityscapes like lonely weeping giants. There have been a number of reasons why we had to wait this long to tell the history of the Holocaust in the East. One of the main reasons has been the geopolitical situation. We haven't had access to the archives in Eastern Europe. Yet one of the other reasons is that historians have not stopped to listen to the voices of survivors until recently. We focus on the voices of perpetrators, namely the Germans. However, now over the past decade and a half, we've begun to listen to new voices, the voices of local accomplices, of neighbors, and more importantly, of survivors themselves, in order to understand how genocide occurs in largely quaint agricultural region like Volhynia. Gendelman ended his poem with the following: "And you, son of Rakitno, from the depth of my heart, I send this poem to the sound of bitter cries. If no one listens, it will drown in heavy waters. You must promise to remember our dear ones and to never forget the Holocaust. Tell this to your children from one generation to the next to always remember. Thanks to the extraordinary work of institutions like the USC Shoah Foundation and the CAGR, new histories will continue to be written about these regions for decades to come. We will remember and we will bear witness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. So we have time for some common questions. I will ask Mario or Doug if you have the first something to say.
I'll ask a quick one. Jared knows that I'm also quite interested in Volhynia. I want to ask you about the difference between the testimonies that you watched in Russian and Ukrainian and those that many of which I've watched in English, and whether you have some sense of whether the historical experience of survivors after the Shoah colors in some way the way they remember it when they are interviewed first after the end of the Soviet Union, in the case of the Russian-Ukrainian testimonies, and having lived their lives mostly in the United States, in case of the English.
I mean, to preface my answer, I'll say, I mean, one of the, well, on that same point, one of the main interests is my interest in the difference is the Russian testimonies are more likely to name names, which is interesting. Also, because the interviews are more likely to ask them. And when you're doing this microhistorical work like I am, I'm sitting there going, please, please ask them the names of the cops. Please ask them the names of the cops. And then, they're less likely to say it. So in the Russian, like you saw with the one today, you can tell that. You can tell that the interviewer is aware that these were neighbors, and whereas in the in the English language ones, it's confusing. I mean, Volhynia's a confusing place, so I really can't blame the interviewers. In terms of the experiences in the post-war era, that's a tough question. I'd have to think about that some more. I mean, I will say, perhaps as an aside, I mean, one of the interesting things is these people are living. I mean, this is this question about what happens, when genocide happens within a small community, and it's done by inside forces and outside forces. This is a question I've always been asking myself: is what happens, after the war? Do you go to the same, magazine? Like, do you buy food in the same place with the people who participated in genocide against your family? And I skipped over a clip today, which I should probably wish I had shown due to time, where a woman from this town of Korest who gives an account of being at a wedding a year before she gives her Shoah testimony, being at a wedding, and she's sitting there with the daughter of the head policeman from Stepan, this guy Tsetzik, who I know, and I have him in my police database, which I was excited to see it. He mentioned Tsetzik. Tsetzik's daughter's at the wedding and says, oh, my father was a communist during the war and he fought in the underground. He didn't hurt anybody. And she said, your father killed my family. And so they had this huge fight. And I've seen a couple other accounts of these. And this is, I mean, it's an incredibly intimate window into what goes on in these communities for decades, and they hold this with them. The same woman gave another testimony saying she would see the son of another policeman in town. He would, and she said he would come and say, "Oh, how are you?" And she would say, "Don't ask me, don't ask me how I am. I don't want to talk to you." So I think, perhaps in looking at trauma and looking at emotions, I mean, these people are still living with the people who did this to them. They walk by, and this is what we talk about, the Holocaust in the East. They could walk by the mass grave. They walk by the synagogue where people were shot. And so I think it's probably much more, it's much more present in their life. Whereas with English language survivors, it's going to be different. Although I should say, which not to plug my next project, but there's a good chance if you're living in New Jersey, you might pass one of your perpetrators because these people were given immigration in the United States after the war. So and some of them were brought over on purpose. But we can talk about that another time. No, I don't. You guys do it.
Where did they go after they fled into the forest? So did they just stay there, or did they return back after the war?
The Jews?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a whole number of strategies, for survival, and again, I didn't get to talk as much about rescue and survival on the run, although there's a lot of that in these testimonies. I mean, the very few cases, people sort of build bunkers and live in the earth, but they constantly have to keep moving around. Many end up joining Soviet partisans, although this tends to be a tricky situation because partisans will often say to them, unless you have guns, we're not going to take you. We're not a charity. So that becomes an issue. And then there are a lot of locals. I'm not going to quantify that, but there are a lot of locals who give them help in some ways. I mean, this is where really, and again, we talk about the gray zones and we talk about how difficult it is to wrap our minds around a place like this. There are a lot of, there are people who do extraordinary acts, and these are people who are recognized as, at Yad Vashem and places like this who hide them for the entire time. But there are also a lot of people who, give them a glass of milk or tell them where to go, but aren't willing to risk their family's lives. And this sort of falls into, a gray zone. But you really, again, watching these testimonies, you really see how difficult it was. And you'll see people who help Jews, Poles or Ukrainians, who help Jews who their own children are in the police. Okay, so when we talk about, again, it's not easy to make these demarcations when we look at genocide in these areas, or their sons are in the UPA and they say, we can't tell my son about this. So it's a very messy situation in the forest. And also interesting as another aside, it's the Czech population, which is 1%. There are about 20,000 Czechs in this region. The Czechs show up. Czechs show up in. Anytime Czechs are mentioned, it's in a positive way, where you see a much more complicated picture about Ukrainians and Poles. Czechs and also Baptists, for some reason, are known among Volhynian Jews for helping. So this is, somebody wants a dissertation topic or something. So it's an interesting question. So.
Thank you. This has been great. Two questions. Were most of the survivors children? Were these survivors necessarily child survivors because of when they were interviewed? That's question one. The other is perpetrators, and you keep saying, we keep hearing their voices. We hear them through formal history archives. Do we talk to them?
Okay. I'll go backwards. Do we talk to perpetrators? I've tried to myself. It's been hard. I was only able to find family members on my own. The Father Desbois, this is a French priest whose father was killed in Ukraine, in Galicia, who started a project to interview people. He went to the people himself, and they interviewed thousands of people in Eastern Europe. Which is an interesting situation. You have a French priest and a sort of like a TV crew with him interviewing folks. They were able to find a number of perpetrators and talk to them too. And I haven't gone through all of those myself yet, and they're very powerful. But this is the issue. One of the few places where we get to see perpetrators' voices are through these post-war trials. And even though, again, it's a Soviet criminal system, which less than ideal, I guess would be a way to put it. We still get to see, we still get to learn about their families. We still, in the one case I use, there's probably 300-400 pages of testimony with the main policeman, and so we really get a chance to hear their voices there. It's less than ideal, but it's sometimes you have to work with what you got. Most of the testimonies we watch are child survivors, I would say, to a degree. I mean, they're not very young, because anybody probably under the age, Doug might have an opinion on this too, like 7 and 8, that's unlikely, but there's sort of this range of, a lot of them seem to be 7 to 15, but there's also the issue of when they did these, these interviews in the 90s, so therefore, I have a few examples of, and actually another survivor who I followed up with, all 4 of his family members survived, mom, dad, and 2 sons. This was very rare. So they, oftentimes you do see a lot of just sort of 10, 12-year-old boys who somehow make it out. But looking into the patterns and sort of looking at the bigger picture about rescue and about how people survive, that's a huge topic in and of itself, and a really important one, I think, for this region.
When you brought up Irvin Miller's story, you brought up how he was in hiding and everything, and the police knew that he was there. Why did they choose that group of people not to harm them in like certain ways, and then how did they choose who were they were gonna kill and who they were gonna harm, who they were just gonna leave like there?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't know the specifics about that police force. I mean, the anecdote about that situation comes mainly from him, but this is, again, you'll see this over and over again where there's no, more times than not, a policeman will turn you in. But sometimes if you have something to give a policeman, if you know a policeman, there's an incredible memoir from this from this region, from Volhynia, where the head of the policeman was good friends with this Jewish family. The father and the mother were already dead. And he was hiding, he and his wife, and he heard that the chief of police was bragging about how he was going to find him. He marches to the home of the chief of police, and the mother and father out in the yard, and they said, "Go away, what are you doing?" And he marches out, and he confronts them, and he says, "If you're going to kill me, do it now, because I'm here. Why waste time?" And the guy, sort of looks at him, and he's angry, and then he says, "Oh, come on, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that to you. I worked with your father." And so then he invites him, and they have dinner together. So it's not always, uniform. But again, people know, people often know who are in hiding, who they can trust, and who they can't trust, because these are the communities that they've grown up in. So you see a lot of different cases. And in this case, the situation too, it's you have to ask questions about, what's, who controls these regions, who's in power, and again, in the middle of the countryside, there's few Germans, there's few other people to assert authority over violence, over the political organs, and so these policemen, these are young men with guns, they're sort of able to do what they want, and so in this situation, they knew that there were Jews who were in hiding. They probably had a deal with the people who were hiding them, or those people were threatened by them, and so they're able to sort of take advantage of the situation.
You gave us, one of the testimonies was of a guy that you said it took him like 9 months to get out of the forest. So I guess my question is, after the war, how did the violence and tension between these two groups affect the, I guess, healing process? How did they merge back into the same society? Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, essentially, this is depending on how you want to frame things. Essentially, what's going on in Volhynia, you have ongoing fighting, guerrilla fighting until 1952, 1953. It takes the Soviets a long time to root these guys out. All things aside, they were very good. They were very good at organizing and building bunkers, building up resistance, and so. It's a complicated situation at first, that the front passes through, the army goes in, they deal with people, they shoot some of these people, but a lot of these nationalists have hidden out, and then they burrow in, and they burrow in because they're waiting for World War III to start. So they believe that the Americans and the Brits are going to come to their rescue. And then what they do is usually tactical killings and assassinations of local leaders. They're obviously not killing as many Jews at this point because, one, Jews who are left pretty much try to leave. And so this is, once you get to 44, 45 in these testimonies, it's how did they get out of Volhynia? And so, people walk, people get on trains, but people try to make their way to the west and try to get to Western, to Germany, where they're able to emigrate to the U.S. But, to the larger question, which is a really good question about the healing process, we can make the argument too that the healing process, really only started to happen once the Soviet Union ended, because, these people were, the nationalists were obviously enemies of the state and branded as such, but there were a lot of people who were forcibly recruited into these armies because they had to. A lot of people who didn't want to be there. So there has needed to be much more open and honest discussions about the violence that occurred and who perpetrated it, and not filtered through this very sort of black and white Soviet lens, which is the way that they looked at the war. And so this is why you see in post-Soviet Ukraine, you see a lot of very difficult, or sometimes a lack of difficult discussions about, who did what to whom during the war, and who were the bad guys. And so, during the Soviet period, Soviet partisans were the good guys, and they were fighting the Germans and fighting the bourgeois nationalists. And then in this post-Soviet period, you've seen a lot of very crude arguments that have just sort of flipped the tables, and they've said that, for instance, this UPA, where they were the good guys and the partisans were going around killing everybody. And there's truth in both stories, because every group was involved in killing in some way. This is what's made it really hard to sort of disentangle and have
a meaningful conversation. But it's still going on, and if you just read the news right now, I mean, the politics of the situation are alive and well. Even with this new regime, they put it, the Poroshenko put in charge of the Institute of National Memory, one of these basically guys who says that the UPA was, a multicultural, loving group that was trying to free Ukraine. So this is in charge of the Institute of National Memory now in Ukraine. So just to give you a sense of what's going on and how difficult it is to have these discussions.
Hi, in one of the early testimonies, a woman was talking about how they asked her if anyone knew what was going to happen, and she said no, that they weren't aware that this pogrom was going to occur. I was just wondering, because such hatred obviously doesn't appear out of thin air, were there evidence of this building in the Ukraine prior to all this occurring? And if so, was that evidence strong enough for certain Jews to be able to flee the country if they were aware and recognized it?
That's a very good question. Let's see. In the account of Tuchin, look. Let's put it this way: terrorism, as we would as we probably define it now, had been going on since basically the end of the First World War. So what happened was, after Ukraine failed to gain statehood, you had a lot of men who had fought in the Civil War, trying to create a free Ukrainian state. Who were armed and also probably very traumatized by their experience of the war, and these were the men who created these nationalist organizations, and they committed small attacks on Jews during the interwar period, but there was rule of law in the Volhynian countryside, which was under the Poles. So life wasn't great, but life wasn't filled with day-to-day violence. And the Ukrainian nationalists, for the most part, during this time, attacked. They focused their wrath on Polish authorities. But again, this brings up, and this is why it's a good question. We call this the longue durée question in history, where this is a region that was not completely immune to violence. There were pogroms during World War I. There have been pogroms in 1905, and then in the 1840s. So so many in these communities do remember the violence from World War I, whether it was committed by the Soviets or whether it was committed by the Polish army or the Ukrainian nationalists during this period. But it was a gamble. But I think most people felt. Even if they thought there were going to be pogroms, there's no way that they envisioned. There's no way they envisioned the mass killings. Nobody thought this would happen. And this is why you see people saying, we're going to stay, because even if the Germans show up, it couldn't be that bad. The Germans were probably the most well-behaved the last time they were here occupying our town. It was the Soviets, and it was the other armies and the Cossacks and other people who were pillaging. So you see a lot of people trying, just sort of measuring what to do. And a lot of people, just don't want to leave their towns no matter what's going to happen. This is the places where they live. But we also know hundreds of thousands did leave. So it was a gamble every time. And like I said, not every community had a pogrom. Many did. But even if you were in a community that didn't have a pogrom, you eventually met your fate through another way. So it was always a difficult situation. But in watching the testimonies, you do get a sense of why people wanted to stay and why people wanted to be with their loved ones and be in their and stay in their community. So I'll end there. That's a very good question.
So I think we are coming to the last question.
Was the insurgent army initially formed as a Jewish hunting machine, or was it just purely a nationalistic group at first, which then became an army, pretty much, into hunting down Jews?
There was an anti-Jewish platform within the organization Ukrainian Nationalists. This is the political group that creates their own army. There was an anti-Jewish platform among this group since the early 1930s. What they wanted to create was an ethnically homogenized Ukraine. When they decide, and again, this is what we talk about making clean cuts and putting things in the certain boxes. When you decide to enact an ethnic cleansing campaign against your Polish neighbors, who had typically been those who had been in charge and who had ruled over this region for so long, you know, while they were at it, they just said, you know, they decided that Jews and other Czechs and anyone else who wasn't going to cooperate would be included as well. And again, there's a lot more complicated issues I don't have time to get into now, but these are also, a lot of these men have already participated in the Holocaust. So they may not participate in the Holocaust because they're anti-Semitic, whatever reasons that they ended up in the police force, but these men then go to the forest to join the UPA, often because they know the Soviets are coming and they might as well hedge their bets with somebody because they know when the Soviets show up, they're going to try them for being in the police. But so then you also have to ask, I think, questions beyond ideology. So these are average men who have already sort of been, you know, have already been involved in mass violence. They've already partaken in mass killings. So when they get orders from the new leaders, which is not a huge group of people who are orchestrating and coordinating the violence in the UPA, when they get new orders and say, we want you to attack this village or we need you to wipe out this family, you know, you have to bring up questions about desensitization, you know, they've already been desensitized, they've already participated in these sort of crimes. And so I think that also plays into it as well. And that's, again, that's also a very good question. Very good students here at USC. So.
Okay, so unfortunately we have to come to an end. I'm really grateful to Jared for his excellent scholarship. I think he shows really masterfully to how to kind of come to new conclusions by using a very diverse set of sources, which he, and I think I can feel by great, gets to go to great lengths to actually discover these sources. So thank you, Jared, and also thank you, Margee and Doug, for this.